Hello, I'm Charlie Winterbauer, co-chair of the Southeast chapter of the Native Plant Society. And today we are continuing with our Native Plant uh, Festival that we hold every September in Wilmington. Today we have Paul Hosier, and Paul Hosier is the coastal plant ecologist with a PhD from Duke University. He served as professor of biology at UNCW for 41 years and is currently professor emeritus at the institution. That means he's retired. Paul, take it away.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I appreciate it a whole lot. And welcome to everyone who might be listening or watching or whatever you can do with Zoom. I'd like to begin by talking about native plants, and especially along the coast. And so let's begin by looking at sort of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I wanted to talk about is coastal plant environment and habitats, because they are really unique in the coastal area, quite different from what you might find in Durham or in Charlotte or somewhere like that. And those of you that may have moved from those areas well know that this is not the same environment you came from. Also want to then move to the different kinds of plants that just a few examples of the kinds of plants that you'd find in those coastal areas of dunes and the maritime grasslands, the maritime shrub and forests, and the tidal marsh areas. And these particular communities will hold a unique set of plants, but at the same time, these plants could be planted in a freshwater or a fresh environment away from the coast. So these are not absolute requirements to be along the coast. And it would be interesting to try some of these because some of them are quite beautiful and quite interesting. Then I wanted to talk just a couple minutes about what I call the bad boys. The bad boys are those plants that you don't want. These are invasive plants, they're non-natives, and they can play havoc in a native plant garden, and not something that you want to have. And then really close with a few interesting plants and that you might find in the coastal area, and that's just a sampling. And really what I'm here to do is cheerlead for native plants, using native plants. And those of you that are very close to the coastline on the barrier islands, or just a little bit inland from the coastline, will find a lot of plants that you can use in your native garden, and others that are more further inland can find plenty of other plants that we'll talk about that are considered coastal, but will grow very nicely in a native plant garden. So let's talk about the coastal environment. It is a very unique environment in that wind and salt aerosols prevail. Those of you that go to the beach every year or every month for that matter, find that the wind is one of the things. Immediately when you strike the coast, you go, wow, it's really windy here compared to further inland. And that seems to be set up by the differential in temperature and the nearness of the ocean. And salt aerosols, as the ocean waves break on shore, you find that the salt aerosols are generated and thrown into the atmosphere, and that really affects the plants in concert with the wind blowing the salt aerosols landward that create, for example, that first photograph you see in the upper right-hand corner is a plant that is strongly affected by salt aerosols. And you've seen those along the coastline. Another example of an environmental factor is salt water and the tides. Anytime you're near the shoreline, the chance of salt water and also the tides affecting you is very likely. And as a result, the salt water and tides will impact what kinds of plants grow where. Again, familiar with the coastal area, you go there for a suntan to get the full radiance of the sunlight and the warm temperatures during the summertime especially, and even year round, because the coldest temperatures are moderated by the nearness to the large body of water, the ocean. So this is temperature wise, and with the amount of radiation received, it affects what kinds of plants can grow there. Soils also, again, those of you that may come from the inland area are familiar with the silts and clay type soils, and you come here and start digging in your yard and area that you're interested in, and it's nothing but sand. And I mean nothing but sand. It's quartz, fine quartz crystals, and quite unlike what you find in the Piedmont or in the mountain areas. And so soils, the ability to survive in these soils is very important. And those plants that we find along the coast are well adapted to that soil, because the water content is usually quite low at the very near the surface, and then gradually gets wetter as you dig down into the soil. And nutrients, same situation. Nutrients usually are tied to clay micelles and that sort of thing that are on silty and clayey soils. In sandy soils, the nutrients go right on through the soil and down to the water table, and are really not available for in large quantities or for very long when you're in the coastal area. Naturally, when you think of the coastline, especially in the last 20 years or so, you think of storms. And when I say storms, I am talking about hurricanes, but I'm also talking about winter storms, the nor'easters. And they can have a really significant impact because they're much more frequent. They're not nearly as intense, but they are frequent. One intense storm like that, if you can look at the history books, so to speak, the storm in March of 1962 that hit the Outer Banks, that was a huge nor'easter, March being in the wintertime. And that had a tremendous change on the shoreline in terms of inlet production and shoreline erosion and flooding, dramatic. So both summer hurricanes and winter nor'easters are important factors. And then finally, you can see the bottom photograph there, human development, any kind of development. You look at a place like Wrightsville Beach or Oak Island, and you know, it's almost wall-to-wall human development in some of these areas. And as a result, the humans have influenced the distribution and the types of plants that are found there, oftentimes bringing new plants and bringing in invasive plants that impact the natural environment. So that's the setup, so to speak, for what we'll talk about, or background to the coastal environmental factors. So beginning with the dune systems, this slide depicts the 5 major plants that we find in southeastern North Carolina. And these will be plants that are extremely well adapted to moving sand. You'll notice immediately that 4 of these are grasses. The grasses are usually plants that can tolerate sand burial, and sea oats and American beach grass are 2 great examples. American beach grass is common in the northern part of North Carolina on the Outer Banks, and really peters out in terms of its natural distribution at Cape Hatteras. And sea oats usually picks up about that same point and goes all the way down to the shorelines along Florida, the Gulf Coast, and into Mexico for that matter. These particular plant species, along with panic grass and salt meadow cordgrass and sea elder, are plants that the more you bury them, the faster they grow. And so they're uniquely adapted to constructing dunes. So as the sand is blown off the intertidal zone, that is the part of the beach or the upper beach where you lay out your blanket or you see the tides coming in and out, when that sand becomes open and dried, the winds pick up the sand and carry it onshore, usually with onshore winds, carry it and build up these dune systems. And the plants are essentially what traps that sand and begins to build the dunes. So any of these will actually survive away from that area, but what I often refer to as they will vegetate. That is, they don't produce a lot of flowers. They don't grow monstrously large like you see on some of the beaches. But you can get sea oats, for example, to grow in a native garden in downtown Wilmington, for that matter. So those are some of the plants that you find along the coast, all natives. American beach grass in the southeastern North Carolina is a little bit out of place because that's beyond its natural limit, but it does grow well. It doesn't flower, surprisingly, here in the southeast. All right, looking a little further inland, especially on the Outer Banks, for example, where we have a lot of flat lands which may have been washed over by storm tides, and the dunes may be flattened out, for example, you're going to find some more grasses: the dune hairgrass, field lovegrass, salt meadow cordgrass, and the broom sedge. All those grasses grow extremely well in sandy soils. They will be buried every once in a while, as you can see in that field lovegrass picture. There is a little wind shadow there where sand is accumulated around that plant, but the others don't necessarily need any sand burial. They'll grow well in any case. And then you have some broadleaf plants, and these are a couple examples: seaside goldenrod and wax myrtle. Both of those plants grow nicely in these flat areas. They've got generally deep roots. Oftentimes the roots not only are deep, but they're wide spreading. And so they're able to accumulate water with the rains. And even though after the sand's dry, they may have deeper roots that will tap some of the water that's below the surface of the sand. So these plants are all, again, plants that have beautiful flowering structures. Look at the maritime bushy broom sedge, and I'm looking out the window. As I look out the window at my own house, I've got maritime bushy broom sedge. It's not quite in the flowering stage yet. Another 10, 12 days, it'll start to be flowering. And this forms a beautiful area where you've got several of these planted. You get a beautiful structure to the plants. And so this particular plant, I love it since I've got it here in the yard, because in the springtime, it's one of the earliest grasses to come out, and it will be green much of the summer. It grows sometimes very tall, 5 or 6 feet, and then puts out that flowering head in late September, early October. After the seeds are dispersed, it turns a real tawny brown color, a gray, almost deerskin color. And as the winter comes on, the entire plant turns that color. And it gives a different contrast to some of the evergreen plants, say, here along the coast that are evergreen all year long. And that makes a nice contrast, both in color and in texture. So that's maritime bushy broom sedge, a great example of a native plant that you don't normally see in your backyard, so to speak, but can be planted, will grow very nicely and produce beautiful plants. Now the trees are both an asset and a liability when we when you think about trees along the coast and the maritime forest, you often think about hurricanes and those trees are going to be down. Not so. Many of these trees and the ones I've got listed here are good examples of trees that survive storms. They won't survive 100%. If you've got a weak tree of live oak, you're going to have that tree, large branch, or the entire tree toppled during a hurricane. But the trees in general that I've got here on this slide grow very nicely. Black gum is interesting in that it's found throughout the entire state, all the way from the mountains to the swamps and the coast. And it's not very common anywhere, but it's present everywhere. And it's a very nice plant, beautiful fruits, as you can see, and wildlife food. And you can plant these in your yard. Usually plant them in a small group, any of these plants, and they will probably grow much better and survive longer when they're in a small clump. And these particular plants have beautiful fruits. Some of them have beautiful flowers like the holly. And they will provide food. You can see that the holly would have seeds that would be available for birds and other organisms, as well as the black gum, which has some nice fruits. And obviously the oaks have acorns, which would be feeding the squirrels and other kinds of wildlife, little mice and rats that run around in the understory. So choosing a native plant instead of a commercially available non-native tree of one sort or another would be a very, very interesting thing to do. And you can be proud of that in a few years when those grow so nicely and grow fairly rapidly because they're adapted to this environment and adapted to southeastern the United States for that matter, and grow very, very well in this kind of environment. Another one you're probably quite familiar with is almost an iconic kind of plant, the cabbage palmetto. And, North Carolina or South Carolina, that's the state tree. I think it's also the state tree of Florida. If you look on the quarters, you're going to, they change a 25-cent piece. If you look at a quarter, you're going to see palmettos even depicted on South Carolina, I think, and Florida both have this particular plant as depicted on a quarter. So it's very important to these areas. And with climate change, with southeastern North Carolina warming up a bit, cabbage palmetto is extending its range and is much more common now in southeastern North Carolina than it was, because it was pretty much restricted to South Carolina and further south. But nowadays you see it growing nicely in southeastern North Carolina. So it probably will continue to migrate northward as our climate change impacts the coastal area. But this particular tree can literally be almost blown where the tops of the trees touch the ground and just snap back into place after the storm has passed. And so it's very capable of surviving storms. And that's really what you want around here in the coastal area. One you might not think of, and that's why I thought I'd depict it here, is persimmon. Persimmons are really, really well adapted to the coastal area. They can survive a little bit of salt spray, and they love sandy soils. And when you've got nothing but pure sand and you've got a hot, sandy, open area, the persimmons grow very, very nicely. And the flowers there are depicted in the lower right. So at certain times of the year, you're going to find flowers on the tree. And, you can remember the native fruits there of the persimmon, which can be eaten when they're fully ripe. And so that's an interesting plant. So it provides food for people as well as for wildlife, as well as a nice pattern of verticality, so to speak, in a native garden. Marshes, the tidal marshes, the ones that are generally wet. There's two main species, the smooth cordgrass and the black needlerush. And these species are well adapted to this kind of environment. And for the most part, this is probably where they grow best. You can grow smooth cordgrass. You could take a plant of this and bring it to your common garden, or you could put it in a pot and it will grow, and it will probably even flower. But this particular kind of plant, if you are right directly on the coast and you've got a bank along the edge of the tidal marsh that's barren or very poorly developed, you can buy these plants and from native gardens and plant them out into that kind of area, and they will grow. So it's a very nice couple of plants that will give a little diversity to an area that probably is neglected in many coastal settings in terms of where houses are constructed, because they don't want to mess with getting down into that marsh. But as native plant aficionados here, we all want to get our feet dirty and our hands dirty every once in a while. And this salt marsh is a great place to do both of those. And these plants will thrive in that area. So if you're in a specific locale, these are great plants. Another one that I really, really enjoy is sea oxeye. It's in the composite family. It looks like a daisy. And this particular plant grows very well in the salt marsh. It's a kind of a colonial plant. It has underground rhizomes and will extend. You can take a single plant or a small group of plants and outplant them in along the upper edge or in the middle of the tidal marsh if you happen to have one. And it will extend. It will gradually increase its area of coverage. And during the middle of the summertime, you have essentially a daisy-like plant growing in your marsh. And again, this is a plant that you could grow in a freshwater environment, or where you have to keep it a little bit wet, not necessarily with salt water, but with fresh water. You can grow this plant and it will survive. Now, I've talked about the dunes, talked about the wetlands, the salt marshes, and I've mentioned the grasslands. And I've mentioned salt meadow cordgrass three times. In fact, 3 times, because it is very adaptable to growing in the dunes where there's plenty of sand burying it. It will grow in the maritime grasslands where there's a lot less sand movement, but it's fairly high and fairly dry. And it will also grow in the upper edge of the tidal marsh. So here's a plant that if you need plant coverage, or you would like to have a display of grasses, this will grow in many different kinds of habitats. And I just wanted to highlight the salt meadow cordgrass as being so adapted to many different coastal environments that you can really find at several locations. And then some other tidal marsh plants that would add some color, as I mentioned at the beginning of talking about the marshes, the tidal marshes. They're fairly monotonous with a couple of species, but there are also little bits of color here and there. And you can see sea lavender and glasswort are 2 other examples, and they're not the only 2. That's just examples that I'm showing you that will grow in the marshy areas and well as the upper edge of the salt marsh. And so you can provide some diversity, some opportunity for insects to pollinate and just enjoy the color changes that you see in dwarf glasswort over the year. So it's a couple of plants that are very, very nice to have if you'd like to diversify what you've got in a coastal environment. Okay, so you've seen a number of coastal plants, and that's just a smattering. That's just the upper layer, so to speak, of the kind of plants you can find in the coastal area. But people have said, those are not enough. I want something else. And so they've invited beach vitex, for example, into the coastal area. It actually was brought to United States from the Pacific, the Western Pacific Ocean, Japan, China, Korea, in that area. And these plants were brought over ostensibly to stabilize the dunes. And really, it was Hurricane Hugo that stimulated this back in 1989. And they brought these plants in. Beautiful plants, as you can see. They've got a nice wide green leaf. They've got beautiful purple flowers. And even the fruits are interesting. There's little structures that are in a clump on a fruiting stalk. And it worked really, really well. I mean, really well. I mean, really well. Within a few years where they initially planted this on dunes that had been disturbed, it took over. It eliminated everything. It was a solid dune of beach vitex. So people were a little concerned that this, although it's very beautiful and it's got some texture and structure to it, it was concerning. The issue was brought to a head when it started growing off the dune on the front side, down into the upper edge of the beach. It would grow right off the dune and move oceanward. That's when the turtle people got into it. And they said, you better get this plant off the beach, because this is where our turtles nest, right at the base of the dunes. And they can't dig in this hole because they're used to their holes for depositing their eggs, because they're used to an open beach where there is no vegetation. So immediately there was work to be done to take care of this plant. And there have been task force in both North Carolina, South Carolina, and probably elsewhere that have fought this plant for a number of years now and been quite successful at it. And it is most offensive near the ocean. And as you get further back, the plant gets a little better behaved. So they're looking for it constantly with task force out walking the beach, looking for growths of this plant and ripping them up as best they can. It's hard to get rid of, so it's got to be constant. So that's one of our nasty little friends. Bad news. Phragmites, many of you are familiar with this along the brackish water, even almost into freshwater environments. Along the coastal area, this particular plant grows anywhere from 10 to 15 feet tall. And you can see it's got a huge flowering head, so it spreads easily. It must germinate like mad. And it also, each plant extends itself each year. It's a perennial. It has an underground rhizome, so it extends further and further. And it is so dense in many places that even the animals, little mice or raccoons or whatever that might go in this area either for shelter or habitat of some sort or looking for food, have abandoned it. And it's not productive at all. You see the red-winged blackbird sitting in the top of the the plant looking for something to do. But other than that, this is really not useful at all for wildlife. And as I say, it gradually takes over wetlands. And when it does, it displaces everything, just like the previous plant. It will displace all the native plants. So another no-no. Another one that's more of a no-no as a result of its presence is the thorny Elaeagnus. And this is a plant that when you put it in the ground, it's a cute little plant, but it quickly gets out of control. It's ugly, as you can see in that lower left-hand photo. It really is quite ugly looking plant if it's not maintained at all. And you can see a two-story building there that is eventually going to have no views if they let this particular plant continue to grow. So this is an especially bad one. The birds love the fruits. As you can see, there's some nice, attractive, juicy fruits there. But one of the things they do is they love those fruits. They eat the fruits, and then they poop the fruit seeds. And as a result, the birds are responsible for spreading this. So it winds up in places where you don't want it. So the thorny Elaeagnus is an example of several species of Elaeagnus that have been imported that are not attractive. So we'll look at one more, the Chinese tallow. This is a plant, if we're talking about southeastern North Carolina, this was not a big deal. I know, and I've done research in the coastal area for going on over 50 years now. And this was not present in southeastern North Carolina for a long time, nor was Phragmites for that matter. But it has been introduced and is really finding its home here. Again, it was invited in as an ornamental. It's got a beautiful, interesting flower structure there on the lower right. The fruits are interesting. It's called the popcorn tree, and you can see why it's with the three white fruits on it in a large head. It makes for an interesting plant, but it is, once it gets into a wetland area, it just reproduces like hell. And as you note here, I've got written, the plant reproduces when it's 3 years old. Most trees, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years before you see the first fruits of a tree, like a hickory. But here, this plant immediately begins to flower and fruit and reproduce. And as a result, it spreads very, very rapidly. And it's very, very difficult to get rid of. So if you see that triangular shaped leaf begin to appear anywhere around your property, you want to get rid of that plant, pull it up and keep checking to make sure it doesn't reappear, and get rid of it as fast as you can. All right, I thought I'd just, as we get close to the end here, talk about a couple of plants that are of interest to people. And again, this is a plant that I have on our property in the back, and other people that live near the coast would probably enjoy. This is a large dandelion. This plant again is in the Asteraceae, and it's almost tree size. It's a fairly rapid grower, so you could plant it in an area. It will grow up and be 15 or 20 feet tall in just a few years. The wood is fairly brittle, and it's easy to cut the plant down and make it disappear, so to speak. So if you wanted to rejuvenate an area, plant this particular plant. We're about to see this developing in the coastal area here. If you travel to Raleigh, for example, you'll see this plant in the next 30 to 50 days. It will be blooming like that photograph on the left and the flowers that are close up on the right. This particular plant will have a nice fall coloration. And so when things are dying back in each fall, this plant will just be coming online. So you get color for a longer period of time in your native garden. So sea myrtle is one that might be interesting to consider as a plant. It will grow easily, and once you get it started, it will continue to grow. As I say, you can trim it if you'd like, or for that matter, you can just cut it down and start over again with a smaller tree, because it's not a long-lived tree. It's more of a shrub, large shrub. One of the plants that I really enjoy, if you've got some trees that will get a little bit of sun over a day's period, to have resurrection fern growing on it. This plant will grow, especially on live oaks where the bark is really crusty and water holds well on it. This plant will grow very nicely. It doesn't grow into the tree. It doesn't have roots or hostoria that grow into the tree, but it will hold onto the tree by putting out small roots that entwine with the crusty bark. And it's enjoyable to see this plant in the middle of the summertime, like that lower photograph, showing the plant all dried up. You say, oh man, this thing will never survive. It's gone. And in a few months or a few days after a good rain, it'll look like the photograph in the center. And it's a fern, as you can see. It's got the fruiting structures, the sori on the bottom of the leaf, and it may actually expand both by growth of the plant and subdivision of leaves or of the stems, as well as by sexual reproduction here of these spores. So very nice plant, something it's an oddity and something you can talk about. So I wanted to show that. And the same thing goes for mistletoe. You don't think of mistletoe as something, a particular plant that is interesting, but it really is. You can see the flowers. I show you the male and female flowers, which are quite different and distinct. It's an evergreen. It stays green, as you can see on this red maple tree. It stays green all year long. And it's got beautiful white berries. If you remember as a kid, having mistletoe to chase the boys and girls around and give them a kiss there at Christmas time. So mistletoe is what's called a hemiparasite. Is obviously green, so it carries on its own photosynthesis, but it also has small hostoria, what's called hostoria, that are kind of roots that grow into the plant. They don't kill the plant. They don't have any real negative impact on the plant. And it makes for a conversation piece, especially during the wintertime when you don't have anything else to talk about in terms of your native plant garden. Maybe you can show the folks the Phorandendron leucarpum, the American mistletoe. So that gives you, I think, sort of a broad paintbrush picture of the kinds of plants that are available in the coastal area that can be adapted to a native plant garden or a particular area of interest that you might have. And I'm really, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm really here as a cheerleader to say, let's look at the kinds of plants that are out there. There really are nice plants. And so I've just put a montage here of, or a collage of plants like the thistle. You wouldn't think of, hey, let's put out a thistle and see that in a common garden, but it really is an interesting plant to have. Beautiful, stunning plants like seashore mallow, a small shrub will grow very nicely. Obviously, the goldenrod, beautyberry. Haven't shown you one with the fruits, but beautyberry is one that is very easy to grow. The birds love the fruits, and so they send the seeds all over your yard. And after you plant beautyberry, uh, what I find is wherever the seeds land and grow, if it looks like a good spot to say, let's have a little beautyberry, I leave it. If not, I pull it up, and there's plenty of others around the yard to see and have in your own native plant garden. Obviously, Spanish dagger there too. So there's some flowers, for example, that are very interesting, and they have timing in terms of the flowers from early spring with the common thistle to midsummer with the beautyberry to seaside goldenrod, which is during the late summer, early fall. So you have color all the time with these native plants. And not only do you have flowers, but you have fruits. Here's the beautyberry fruit. You can see a beautiful mauve, purplish color. I really like that color. It's stunning. And the beautyberry is, as I say, very easy to grow. Flowering dogwood. We have dogwoods in the yard that are very nice. Climbing hempweed I put in there because it's not something you would see. It's a vine, and it has interesting flowers. It's in the aster family, the composites, and at the end of the year we have a nice distribution of fruits, and it makes for a stunning pattern. Prickly pear cactus, purple passion flower, you're probably familiar with those, and they have very attractive and interesting fruits. But again, as you're building up an area of native plants, gives you a different textures, different colors, and makes it for a very interesting backyard or front yard or side yard or wherever yard. All right, so just to kind of bring this to a close, what we've seen here and sort of capturing what we've said, the coastal native plants grow in a variety of sizes, shapes that we've seen. They're well adapted, so they grow nicely in coastal habitat. We've seen colorful ones, we've seen useful ones. These are what native plants do for us. And also caution you that the bad apples, the bad guys, we want to get rid of those. So as best we can, as soon as you can replace them, get rid of them and replace them with natives. Everybody will be a lot happier, including your neighbors, probably, because most of these bad apples spread very easily and take hold. And if you turn your back on them, they will take over. All right, so the last bit of advice I might have is where do you put these plants? Which ones are you going to use? And these are just some guidelines here. By consulting your professionals, the master gardeners are a great resource to provide information. The Sea Grant program does the same, as well as the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And get on your phone, take a look at what's available, and see what information you can gain, what plants are most successful. And the last bit of information would be, watch out what you ask for, because when you begin planting these plants that may be pollinated by native insects or fed upon by the insects or insect larvae, and the birds, the mammals, small mammals, and deer, and all that. So they all come with bringing in the native plants. Many yards are sterile because the deer don't recognize any of those plants. And they go, well, let's go next door where I know what some of these plants are, and we'll have a good meal. So you do want to have native plants, but you also get some of the native animals. And that in itself is an attraction, so to speak, because you begin to see butterflies and birds and little creatures of one sort or another that you have not seen before because you didn't have the native plants in abundance like you would if you focused on those. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for joining me for the length of time that we've had here today. I hope that you've got something interesting out of that. And again, I'll turn the meeting back to Charlie.
Thank you, Paul. One thing I want to close with, I don't know if you can see it on the video or not, but I can name it. Paul came out with a book several years ago called Seacoast Plants of the Carolinas. And besides being a good guide to the plants, the first 8 chapters or so are a fantastic discussion of the ecology, the environment along our coast here, and it's well worth reading for that alone. But I thank you all, and we will see you some other time.